Here's something you might not know, Cover Killer Nation. My very first heavy metal album was the one we're talking about today. Very first one I bought, at least. Reload by Metallica. Yeah. I think I mentioned that sometime before, but if not, and for all the people who are new, surprise, surprise. It's kind of funny what happens. Funny what happens in a couple of years. Or in this case, for about a year. There were so many songs in the Load sessions that, well, there were a lot that definitely needed to hear the light of day. And considering Load was so, tilted to the chord, and the fact that it was 79 minutes by itself, that, well, another album had to be released. And, well, a little bit more than a year later, that's exactly what happened. Reload. So, there's a little bit of time for everything to breathe a little bit on Load, so Reload was able to really get its opportunity to be packaged up and see the light of day with another, 13 tracks worth of Metallica goodness. Tasties. Yum. Now this is one that's a little bit different than Load. With Load we had a couple of key singles, but we also had a couple that were kind of busts. With this one, actually, surprisingly enough, it almost sounds as though the band's a little bit more reinvigorated. But that's kind of difficult to say. This is the same style, stylistically, as Load, so we're not seeing that much of a dramatic change here. So, fans who picked up Load and enjoyed it were going to really enjoy Reload. Fans who picked up Load and perhaps were less than satisfied, well, they might still pick up Reload because it's Metallica, but they might not be as satisfied as they hope. From the opening lines of Fuel, though, you can definitely tell it's going to be a little bit different as opposed to, Load's Ain't My Bitch. It's definitely a bit of a difference. Not to mention, Fuel ended up being a massive single. It's definitely one that's still used to this day. I think it's still used for NASCAR, which, well, I guess makes sense. They use a lot of fuel, and sometimes cars catch on fire, and those crashes are definitely what Americans desire. Ooh. But other singles, such as The Memory Remains, which had Marianne Faithfull on it, as well as The Unforgiven 2, also really propelled this album quite a bit as well. Especially the videos for each of these. The Memory Remains was actually, it wasn't the first Metallica video that I saw, however it was the first Metallica video that really I saw as it was coming out, and it really, gave me a lot of excitement for this record. I really liked this sound because at that time it was the only Metallica that I really knew. It was only later, whenever I discovered their 80s thrash era stuff, that I recognized that, well, these two albums were actually a little bit weaker whenever it came to the remaining parts of their catalog. Now, I also love the song on this album called Carpe Diem Baby. It had a very simplistic riff to it to many people. However, I just really dug it. It was one that's, even to this day, I still like to throw on every so often, and it brings back some really great memories. Now, the one thing that I will say that this album is able to boast that's a lot better than Load is the fact that as you get closer to the end of this record, things definitely pick up a little bit. They stay and remain consistent. Now, I said in the last video that I think I may prefer Load a little bit more than Reload, but it was kind of a hard thing to say. This second half is actually the reason why I say that, because even though the first half of this disc is strong and does boast the singles, and I think these singles did a little bit better, I don't know if I really like that side as much. Now, on the other side, the second half of Reload, I love a lot more than I do the second half of Load. With tracks such as Where the Wild Things Are, Low Man's Lyric, that's really showing a little bit of, overall diversity on there, I really just like the way that that went. Now, sure, songs such as Prince Charming and Attitude aren't exactly, the best, but at the same time, they seem to offer a little bit more as far as the, overall, steering the ship and keeping it on the proper course than the second part of Load really was able to give us. Now, whenever you really look at this album as a whole, whenever you examine it as a complete piece of music, this is one that doesn't feel as cluttered as Load does. This is also one that's a little bit shorter than Load, which definitely works to its benefit. It's one that's over a little bit faster, though it does still feel like it drags its feet a little bit. Fixer is definitely a closing track that kind of compares a little bit to the Outlaw Torn, only I don't think it's really as good as the Outlaw Torn is. It tries its best, and it does its best to really be kind of creative and interesting, and for that said, it's probably an average to, above average song on this record. But at the same time, it just doesn't have the same intensity, it doesn't have the same, expansion of the narrative or the expansion of the song as, the Outlaw Torn was really able to feel on Load. Now, once again, this was another album that did #1 numbers for the band, so they had scored their 3rd straight #1 album, and at this point in time, Image and Everything was just something that was being thrown around the office and was actually happening. It's something that Lars and Kirk were apparently pretty big into. I didn't mention in the Load review that the cover of that one was kind of interesting. It was nothing but blood and semen. Yeah, it was kind of a really, really weird artsy piece. Whereas on this one, you get like a dust bowl, dust tornado type deal, or dust storm. It's another interesting piece. So, yeah, compared to the ones in the past, the cover art isn't exactly all that thrilling. But at the same time, the stories behind it, they're kind of weird. So overall, as an album, Reload basically picked up where Load left off, because that's the same sessions. You know, there's no difference in the sessions or anything like that. So, as far as a part 2 is concerned, this one's kind of narrow, which one's truly better. I still think I like Load just a pinch more, just a hair more, but it's basically because it's a tale of two sides. If you actually combined Load's first half with Reload's second half, there's a good chance that I could love this record. Of course, I could just pick and, choose which songs that I really want to build the perfect Load album, I guess. Blow the perfect Load, whatever you want to say. But if I really had to do it that way, that's kind of how I would do it. These are also albums that divided a lot more people than it really, brought on board. Well, that might actually be a lie. These definitely brought a lot of people on board, principally because they were getting significant airplay, not to mention they were starting to get a lot of rotation on MTV and VH1. When, you might be asking? Yeah, they still played music videos back then. This was back before MTV sucked ass and VH1 was like, what's that? Finally, and perhaps most importantly, these were moments where a lot of people who were classic fans of the band really felt as though the band needed to do something a little bit different. They started to feel as though the band that they had loved in the 1980s were starting to distance themselves from them in the 90s, which is the reason why you hear the term sellout kind of get thrown out there. For the record, Metallica didn't sell out. Metallica did cut their hair, but they didn't sell out. They didn't cut their hair because somebody said, hey, I'll pay you $1 million if you cut your hair. If somebody asked you to do that, you'd do it too. Let's be frank here. $1 million is $1 million. I believe that Lars Ulrich said it best, that it's what Metallica's really always been about. If you're not constantly exploring and expanding your sound, well then just fucking die. It's essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but that's it. So, while there are albums of Metallica that I don't necessarily like, and that I feel that are poor excuses, well, this is one where I can kind of understand it. They enhanced it a little bit. But then they got a little bit better. But the album that we're going to talk about next, it's not an official studio album. In fact, it's one that probably we shouldn't even talk about. But we're going to. Principally because it was a really important part and an important step in my role and my life as a metalhead. And it's definitely one that I'm sure has inspired a couple of other people along the way as well. So up next, we're going to talk about Metallica going back to the garage, digging up their old demos and their old covers, and adding a whole hell of a lot more, including one that would go down in Cover Killer Nation history as probably one of the sickest and most badass Metallica songs of all time. We're going to talk about Garage Incorporated next, so stay tuned.